Thank you. I hope I can live up to that expectation. As an immediate disclaimer, we are a firm of architects, and the only time we ever started thinking about hospitals was in the summer of 2019 when somebody asked us, and he asked us largely because we didn't know anything about hospitals, and it was a client who considered that a big advantage. I've called my talk the Hospital of the Future, which maybe is a little bit presumptuous. It's the name of an ongoing research project that we have in the office, which I think, given our recent involvement, is mainly to educate ourselves. But be that as it may, the research is meant to result in a book that comes out this year, where mainly this is formulated as a question to which I think there are multiple answers. Before we talk about the Hospital of the Future, I think it is important that we talk about the hospital today, or about hospitals today. And hospitals are very much alike. Hospitals have a lot in common, sort of wherever you go. And I think it is very, very curious that if you consider that the main task of a hospital is to care for people, that the environments they generate don't seem to care about people. You see this impenetrable fortress, and it's quite representative of what a lot of hospitals look like, I'm afraid to say. And hospitals are either large, anonymous, ugly, or distant. And I think it is fair to say that it's probably largely the fault of hospitals that most people dislike modern architecture, because they represent the worst of modern architecture. There's another thing that hospitals have in common. Even though they're supposedly built for eternity, they often don't last a very long time. I have a particular sequence. This is a hospital in Metz, built during the First World War, demolished very recently, didn't last a century. Another hospital in Montreal, built in the 30s, lasted for about 19 years. Another one built in the 30s lasted 71 years. Another one, 30s, lasted for 64 years. Then we moved to the 60s. They started to last for about half a century, demolished in 2015. Another one, it gets shorter and shorter. This is built in the 70s, lasted for about 40 years in Glasgow. In the 70s, lasted less than 40 years. Here is a building that lasted even less than 30 years, built in the 70s, and less than 30 years. And this one is the record, at least we could find in our research. The Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, built roughly in 1980 and demolished already after a quarter of a century. So if you look at all these examples, there is a very interesting trend. The more recently hospitals are built, the quicker they have to be demolished. So the more bespoke, the more state-of-the-art, the supposedly more modern they are, the sooner they're out of date. And this is mesmerizing for an architect, of course. How do you make sense of this? And if you continue the trend, in the future, the lifespan of a hospital will be negative. That means that you conceive not its construction, but its disappearance. That becomes the quintessential design task. So there's the trend again, shorter and shorter and shorter, while the trend, and this is probably partly the explanation, while the trend of medical innovation is the exact opposite. The doubling time of medical knowledge in the 50s was like decades. In current days, I think medical knowledge doubles every 72 hours. So then hospitals become very paradoxical environments. They're the home to all kinds of sci-fi equipment. I don't know how it works, but I'm assuming it's extremely advanced. The hyperbaric chamber, the proton beam, and then the building itself is a kind of dispiriting environment that plays a game of catch-up, almost perpetually, that like airports, it is in a permanent state of conversion. It's finished, and then it's not finished, and then it's not finished, and it's never finished. So that, for us, brought back a very interesting typology, that of the army hospital. a type of hospital that is meant to adapt, that is meant to be converted, and that is also meant to disappear once it's served its purpose. And this was the summer of 2019, before all hell broke loose in terms of COVID. But then very quickly, the Army Hospital found its way into an acute application here in the context of COVID. And not only the Army Hospital, I mean, the hospital was confronted with a degree of improvisation which was unprecedented in the tradition of hospital design. Stadiums became hospitals. Convention Centre became hospitals. Even the Excel in London became a hospital. The inside of trains turned into hospitals. Boats turned into hospitals, to the point that you wonder, is the dirty secret of the hospital that you don't need a hospital? And interestingly, that appeared to be what the world was thinking until COVID came. This is a graph going back to the 60s about the global reduction of hospital beds everywhere, with the exception of Korea. I don't know why. But the global trend is to reduce beds, to reduce the times you stay in hospital. And this is a very interesting example. The University Hospital in Caen by Henri Bernard, slated for demolition with about 1,600 beds, replaced by a more modern project recently with about 1,400 beds, so 200 beds less. And that 200 beds was exactly the number of beds that they needed to absorb the COVID onslaught. So you wonder, I mean, is newer always better? Is innovation, is there a problem?
You're asked to use this microphone because this apparently doesn't work well.
Oh, okay. Should I start again?
No. So far your pictures are very...
Anyway, in the context of all of this, somebody actually asked us to do some real work on a hospital. This is Qatar, a virgin site to the north of Doha with an infinite amount of space, where HMC, Hamad Medical Corporation, that is the Qatari equivalent of the National Health Service, the NHS, only with a bit more money, who asked us to work on a 1,300-bed hospital. And they were managing medical facilities in Qatar, which looked like this, and I guess they look like the unflattering examples I showed at the beginning. And they had a very extensive brief. I think this, as an architect, this was by far the most extensive brief I've ever had to read in my entire life, and it required some Ausdauer. But the interesting thing was that the vast majority of this brief was actually a critique on their own facilities, which were not future-proof, which were rigid, which catered to machine, they didn't cater to people enough, etc., etc., etc. A large part of the brief was actually about all what was wrong with what they had. In a way, they asked us to look at the standard typology of hospitals, analyze it, dismiss it, and in a way, make an inventory of all the drawbacks of the predominant typology of the hospital, the podium with the slab, and in a way, explore the qualities of a hypothetical antonym, a hospital that is not high but flat, and subsequently has a whole range of advantages that directly address the disadvantages associated with the 20th century hospital. So that we did. I mean, they shared with us a fascination for military hospitals, of course, partly because that type of settling, I guess, is embedded in the culture of Qatar, but also partly, I'm not trying to be offensive. This is the very first hospital that was built in Qatar after the war, the Rumeila Hospital, a two-story building around a number of courtyards, still in operation. And we partly made a proposal that adopted that principle. When you make a courtyard, flat courtyard typology. The interesting thing is that in addition to what you built, you get a certain amount of unbuilt space in tandem that you can program and use for the hospital, a series of about 30 gardens. And the garden in traditional Islamic medicine plays a big role in curing, in healing, in a way, providing all the emotional things, music, gardening, dancing, all the emotional things you need in addition to the hardcore technical medical process in order to get well. So this is the hospital we designed, a series of 30 courtyards with a number of smaller buildings inside the courtyards, creating 2 grids in a way of inpatients and outpatients, clinical facilities mostly on the first floor with the express aim to realize most bed wards directly on the ground floor, so that beds are on the ground, they kind of hug one of the courtyards and also allow access from the rooms via a shaded gallery into the courtyards, which means that the whole hospital, in a way, is a combination of 2 worlds, the sterile, clean, hygienic, infection-free technical world to the left, which has almost the longest possible interface and view onto a space that is about all the opposites, that is romantic, that is emotional, that is ornamented, that is colorful, that is, in a way, everything else. The last thing I want to talk about is the tasks in hospital. We looked at, of course, a hospital is a place for patients, people who are sick. A hospital is also a place to work. And I think some statistics indicate that about 70% of all medical professionals are considering a career change. The extent to which that has to do with the architecture in which they work, I don't know, but I could imagine it doesn't really help. An increasing number, though, of these tasks are being done by machines. And I think if you make an analysis, you end up at about 40%. It's on the increase. So the hospital of the future, you could increasingly imagine as a space for human labor, as a space for human interaction, but also as a home for machines. And you can already see it, in a way, in images of the hospital, the way it works today. Now, machines have different spatial requirements than people. I mean, you showed that very eloquently in the presentation. So to some extent, the most predominant feature of the contemporary hospital, the corridor for people, is a corridor for machines like that. So what we did in a 3rd layer, an underground layer, there is a whole system of tunnels which doubles up with the corridors and the gridded structure of the hospital. Those tunnels are very small tubes connected to a logistics center next door, and then a whole additional circulation space for machines underground. Hospitals require resources, and very often there is an invisible part of the hospital to provide, the infrastructure to provide those resources, which is this. And one of the things we considered here, given the fact that we had a very large site, a very remote site, almost like a site where the desert looks like you're on Mars, that some of the infrastructures to cater to the resources could actually double up as research facilities, that they could not only be spaces of provision, but also spaces for research and experiment. I'll explain too. There is, of course, the notion of food provision for the hospital. Qatar has a very extensive farming program of irrigated farms in the desert for food autonomy. One of the things I think is an interesting notion that the contemporary hospital could double as a farm. But from farming, it's a very small step to farming. You could say that, of course, drugs are made from plants too. I mean, drugs have a vegetative component, and you can imagine a form of indoor farming, a very form of high-tech farming, where drug production is ultimately happening on the site of a hospital itself. Hospitals, and that's particularly in America a very, very big thing, are increasingly trying to liberate themselves from the stranglehold of big pharma for local and autonomous drug production, which we could imagine here on site. The other facility we looked at is a 3D printing facility. Of course, 3D printing has an application in terms of organ transplants, producing medical components, but 3D printing obviously also has an increasingly an architectural application. The nice thing is the return of ornament. It doesn't take centuries, but you press O on your keyboard and you have ornament. I think it's probably slightly more complicated than that, but so we imagine that particularly the galleries around the courtyards, the whole building is modularly built, but the galleries around the courtyard would be 3D printed structures where, in a way, each courtyard could kind of be different, and there could be an endless amount of ornament and variation in a way for each, simply produced by these machines. We could imagine, in a way, adding color to the ornament, where, in a way, each courtyard requires a different color and a different identity in addition. And then, if you add up all of the things together, all of the research facilities together, then more than this kind of structure per se, you zoom out, and the hospital becomes the heart of a kind of an industrial city that is resilient, fairly autonomous, also in terms of energy provision, logistics, production, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, in a way, the project we did there, and that's it.